We're up to the third chapter of Shoftim in our journey through Nach. Our topic today is the left-handed swordsman. Before we start, I want to take a moment to thank Lori and Shalom Huberfeld, who are sponsoring as we mark the Yortzeit Bo Bayom Rosh Chodesh Nisan of Shalom's father, Pinchas ben Moshe Aaron. And among the many attributes of that stood out to me is his ability to look forward, to always be able to not be shackled by the past, by the complexities, by what he had went through, and always looking forward. And that expressed itself in so many ways, whether it's the business that he created, the family he fostered, the yashrus that he exhibited, and the Torah that he learnt in so many different ways, was a description of a person who was always looking at the horizon, not looking behind it, to figure out why he was a victim. And I think that's why, ultimately, Jews are not included in DEI. It's because Jews have never been victims. They've chosen not to be victims, which is why society around us doesn't recognize us as victims, because we continue. Anyways, it is Be'ezra Hashem Nishmos like Eden. He should have a lichte Gan Eden, as we learn for him this special morning. We have an amazing chapter ahead of us, unbelievable chapter in Tanakh. It is the third chapter in Sefer Shoftim, and although it is really not so long, it's only 31 psukim long, this chapter actually spans 120 years, practically. So it's a very long parak in that respect. We're going to look at it in 4 different sections, and 2 of them are going to be stories. The first 2 are more the preamble. But let's start at the beginning. We now know that Israel did not do such a good job in conquering their neighbors. They weren't doing such a fantastic job. And so now we hear what happens because of this. And in this is the complexity. Just listen to the first 3 psukim for a second, just to get a sense of what's going on here from the godly perspective, the theological perspective. Ve'elu hagoyim asher niach Hashem lenasos b'amis Yisrael, es asher lo yadu es kol milchamos Canaan. These are the nations Hashem left over the people, for Israel to conquer. Rak leman das doros b'nei Yisrael l'lamdom milchama rak asher lefanim lo yadaum, to teach Israel so that Jews should be warriors, so they should be able to know how to fight. Their continued responsibility. So from a theological perspective, Hashem is doing this intentionally. But keep going. Here are the nations. The 5 princes or chieftains of the Philistines, the Canaanites and the Sidonians, those are Phoenicians. Hachivi, the Hivites, Yoshvei Hara Levanon, Mehar Baal Cherimon, and Levoi Hamas. These are the areas that are remaining. Vayiyu lenasos bam es Yisrael adas hayishmeu el es mitzvos Hashem asher tzivos avosam beyad Moshe. And they were left in order to test them. Were they going to listen or not? And unfortunately, the truth is they did not, which is what the last pasuk in the section is Vav vayikchu es benoseihem lenahem lenashim ve'es benoseihem nasnu livneihem vayavdu es Eloheihem. So they intermarried. Their daughters married their sons. The Israelite daughters married the Canaanite sons, and soon afterwards they were serving their gods. This should be parallel. It should remind us of language we've heard before in the Torah, where if you remember the proposition made to the children by the children of Yaakov to Shechem and Hamor was, we're going to be one nation, one small medical procedure, and our daughters will marry your sons and your sons will marry our daughters, and everything's going to be just fine. That we've heard that proposition. We're seeing it play out now, this notion of intermarriage, one nation. It doesn't work. But nonetheless, this is unfortunately the expression of it. A few things to note just before we go further. So where are these nations? So just follow me to the map just after these psukim here, and just a sense of what the Middle East looks like at this time. Okay, so Israel is a small sliver in the center of the Middle East, but surrounded on all sides are, in the bottom right corner is Edom, above them is Moab, above them is Ammon. So those are the Trans-Jordan East nations. Then we have Aram. Aram stretches all the way from where we have Jordan, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria to Iraq. And then on the left side, in the green, is the Hittites. That's the Hittite area. So the Hittite were generally speaking in the area leading into Turkey, and Lebanon to Turkey. And then we have Phoenicia along the coast and Philistia along the coast moving downwards. So we're surrounded by all these nations. This is what we hear about. Now we actually see it in action. Okay. See, we got the sense of the lay of the land, just geographically what's happening around us. Well, now, here is a really fascinating observation. I guarantee you that none of you have read the book of Bereshis from this prison beforehand, because it's a rather disturbing one. But here we go, if you run just a minute back. So here we go. Rabbi Sachs has an essay in the book of Bereshis, and it is the topic of the essay is called, "What is the theme of the stories of Genesis?" So he says, can you possibly tell us that there is one theme to the book of Bereshis? And the answer is, you would say, well, there's a lot of themes, right? So his observation is, listen to this striking paragraph. Striking. He says, there is an answer, but an unexpected one. One theme appears no less than 6, possibly even 7 times. Whenever a member of the covenantal family leaves his or her space and enters the wider world of their contemporaries, they encounter a world of sexual free-for-all. Think about that from a perspective of all of Bereshis. That is a shocking observation. Now, if you think about it, it reminds me. I just saw this thing. Rabbi Lewis mentioned this, but this frum couple sitting in Sharm el Sheikh, and and he says to her, "Just tell them you're my sister." So it's fantastic, but it's so good. But the point is, the reason that had to happen the first time around was because of that exact problem. And it happens again, Avimelech and Sarai. And then it happens later on with Yitzchak Avimelech, and Rivka. It's going to happen so many times. We're going to see Yosef and Potipharah. We're going to see Dinah and Shechem. Anytime you have an interaction of the covenantal community in the outside world, there is sexual licentiousness which is associated with it. Why is that? What's the argument he makes? It's such a profound argument. We talked about this beforehand. He says, this gives us an entirely new way of thinking about the Abrahamic faith, emunah. The Hebrew word normally translated as faith does not mean what it's taken to mean in English, a body of dogma, a set of principles or a cluster of beliefs often held on a non-rational grounds. Emunah means faithfulness, loyalty, fidelity, honoring your commitments, doing what you said you would do, and acting in a way as to inspire trust. It has to do with relationships, first and foremost with marriage. Meaning marriage is going to be our example of what commitment to God is. And therefore, if we're going to be in a society which is godless, it means it's also marriageless too. That's what that type of society is. That's a very profound argument. Listen to this observation about society now. He says, when a society loses faith, eventually it loses the very idea of sexual ethic. And the result is the long term is violence and exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. Women suffer, children suffer. There is a breakdown of trust where it matters most. So it was in the days of the patriarchs. Sadly, so it is today. Judaism, by contrast, is the sanctification relationship, the love between husband and wife, which is as close as we'll get to understanding God's love for us. That's a profound observation in just society. Do you know what the unfortunately the rape rate is in South Africa? I mean, look at these countries. Understand what's going on in that society. A godless society. That's where it expresses itself in this. I think it's just an incredible observation, and I believe it's happening over here. The Gemara makes this observation long before Rabbi Sachs, but just the way the Gemara says it, and now reading Jewish history is so profound. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, in Daf Samach Gimel and Beis, just the previous source says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Israel knew pagan worship was meaningless. I mean, what kind of nonsense is this? Right? You make a god and serve a god. What is this? They did so in order that they could have sexual liberation, that they could have relationships. Think about this. If I have God in my life, therefore I can't behave as I want. Relationships are restricted. I want to have freedom. I want to have freedom of expression that way, so I don't want God who's going to be breathing down my neck in that respect. Which means the process, ironically, the process is exactly matching that pasuk Vav in Sefer Shoftim, which is they married their daughters and served Avodah Zarah. Serving Avodah Zarah was a byproduct, but it wasn't the goal. The goal was actually intermarriage, is freedom of expression in relationships, not having restrictions. If you read about the debauchery that's associated with pagan service around the Canaanite times, that relates to impropriety and immorality, it matches this. The starting point is, when a person doesn't want restrictions, therefore they're going to find some sort of religious framework that's going to support such a lifestyle. That's what's happening over here, and that relates to the freedom of relationship which is expressed. So just to understand this historically, it's just a fascinating observation in reading Sefer Shoftim. And when we read Bereshis, it's quite an eye-opener. Now, let's move into our first of our situations, our first of three situations. So we move back to the text, and we hear about the nation of Israel starts sinning, they're intermarrying, they're serving Avodah Zarah, and now HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets angry with them. Pasuk Ches, Vayicharaf b'Yisrael, Vayimkarem b'yad Kushan Rishasayim Melech Aram. He are sold into the hands of this person called Kushan Rishasayim. He's the king of Aram. Now Aram Naharaim, Vayavdues b'nei Yisrael's Kushan Rishasayim Shmona Shanim, and they serve him for 8 years. That does not mean they're bowing down to him. That means they're financially paying him lots of money, okay, because they're under his thumb. And Israel calls out to God, and Hashem sends in the Yoshia as savior, and his name is Osniel ben Knaz. We've heard about Osniel beforehand. He's the Achi Kalev HaKaton Mimenu. He is the younger brother of Kalev ben Yefuneh Kenizi, and he conquers Kushan, subdues him, and Israel now acts as an independent state. They're not a subservient state, and they have 40 years of peace and quiet. That's what we hear in this section. So a few things just to be aware of is who is Kushan Rishasayim. So just an interesting thing about the Hebrew language is that whenever you have an ayim at the end, it means double, right? So for instance, I have yad, and then we have yadayim. I have ozen, I have oznayim, right? So whenever you have ayim at the end, it means doubling of that word. Which means that if we have a person of Kushan Rishasayim, so it's almost as if his name is doubly bad, right, Rishatayim. But what's interesting to me is where he lives, which is Aram Naharaim. What's Naharaim mean? If Ozen and Oznayim that means 2 rivers. So which 2 rivers are used? So if you remember studying ancient civilizations, you will remember that the cradle of all humanity is between the 2 rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia. That's the birth of civilization. So therefore, now technically speaking, if you go further back, you go to the Neanderthalic, go down to South Africa, that's where they say the cradle of it. But nonetheless, in terms of civilization we trace back to between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So it is likely to assume that Aram is referring to that, Mesopotamia itself. Now Aram being the 2 rivers that frame, and the reason is because that is the fertile area. That's where they're going to be establishing their kingdom. So he's coming from there. If you think about it, that is in the area of Iraq today. Okay, so our enemy is coming from Iraq, and we've seen these types of things before and in Tanakh before, because if you go back to Parshas Lech Lecha, we hear about this alliance of four monarchs who take control of all the smaller nations, and those monarchs, for the most part, are coming from far east. They're not local. Elam, if you read about Elam is really far out. We'll go, when we get to Lech Lecha, it's just fascinating to trace the geography of those 4 kings. But they're coming from far northeast. Similarly, over here, a northeastern kingdom is coming and taking taxes from another. And this is the beginning of what we'll call proto-empires. Right? We're not an empire yet, but they're taking taxes from smaller nations. One of them being this nascent state of Israel. Okay, what is interesting just to notice in terms of geography is that we're going to see that the enemies of Israel are going to be coming closer and closer and closer. Right now, the enemies are from the outside, and sometimes it's easier when the enemies from the outside. You say it's them, right? We're not even sharing a border, it's them. But now we're going to start seeing, as we go further into the book of Shoftim, it's getting closer and closer and closer to in and amongst their midst, leading to the Plishtim, who are literally our neighbors all the way through. So it's worth us noting that the enemy starts outside as well. Who is Osniel? We know Osniel. Osniel, we've already encountered. He's Kalev's brother, and we know that Kalev had this whole bet about who's going to conquer this area called Devir, which he calls Kiryas Sefer, and Osniel conquers. The Gemara imputes into this that this is referring to a level of reacquiring the Torah ideas that were lost at the times of Yoshua, at the times of Moshe Rabbeinu's death. So Osniel is a known entity. He's clearly a spiritual leader. He acts now as a military leader as well, both in Devir and pushing back Kushan Rishasayim, and which is why the Midrash says about him that the end of the Yalkut Shimon in source 3 says Ad Shalai Shaka Shimshol Shel Moshe Zarcha Shimshol Shel Yoshua. Ad Shalai Shaka Shimshol Shel Yoshua Zarcha Shimshol Shel Osniel ben Knaz. while the sun of Moshe was setting, the sun of Yoshua was rising. When the sun of Yoshua was setting, the sun of Osniel was rising, which means to say is that there is continuity. He's living in the same generation, which leads me to make the observation, which is the 40 years of peace that were ensued after Osniel are probably including some of the time of the Zakanim, because Osniel was of that generation. The first of our Shoftim after Yoshua, after the Zakanim, is a person who's already around. There's a link in the chain. He lived then, they knew him, so it makes sense, but I would imagine that the 40 years therefore begin or perhaps inclusive earlier, because I'm just bearing that in mind, bearing his lifespan in mind. So here we have the first of our Shoftim. We don't know so much about him or the details. We know it's a period of quiet. Generally speaking, Tanakh does not spend so much time talking about the quiet. Meaning, if you read Tanakh, it becomes an absolutely depressing enterprise, especially if you're learning Sefer Melachim, right, when we get there. It's very, very intense. And the reason is because the Nevuah that only things you need for us to learn the lessons from were written. So the quiet periods, we don't need to learn from. So 40 years of quiet, that's fantastic. Economy was great, spirituality was great. It sounds like everything was all right. They didn't write about it. So we don't hear so much about this. And apparently it was a successful era. What leads us now is to our next era, which is our next Shofet. And this is where we hear about another nation. This is also an external nation. This nation is Moab. So in the Psukim we hear about how Moab now starts taking over, and the king of Moab is a person by the name of Eglon. Eglon comes and he sits in a place called Ir HaTzamarim, the date city. What's the date city quickly? This is Jericho. Jericho is the city of palms. Okay, so he takes over. He makes a palace in Jericho. He takes over this area, and they are subjugating the nation of Israel after the period of Osniel. Osniel dies. They return. They slip back to their spiritual wayward ways. They now become under the power of Moab, and such is the case. They are now paying money to Moab. They're now subjugated to Moabite ways. So we hear about this fellow called Ehud. Ehud is Ishimini. He is a Benjaminite. And we hear there's an Iter Yadoi, so that it sounds like he does not have the use of his right hand. But he comes with a delegation of Israelites to Eglon, and we have this dramatic story where he comes with a mincha, which is some sort of homage that they're paying to the king of Moab. They come to his palace, and they deliver the mincha, and as he's going back, he turns back and he says, Devar li Seiser, I have a secret matter for the king. And they say, okay, we understand. They usher him in, the guards usher him in. They obviously, in those days when they had the metal detectors, they only checked the side where you drew your sword from, right? So generally speaking, you keep your sword on the left side of your belt because you pull it out as such, right? But it happens to be, as in baseball, the havdil, right? Your left-handed batters have a little bit of an advantage, right? So the left-handed swordman had an advantage because he stores his sword on his right flank, but he doesn't even have a sword. He has a cubit's length, so we're talking about a cubit level double-bladed dagger, which he keeps on his right flank. So when they're doing the pat-down at the TSA check at the entrance to Eglon's castle, they do not find anything suspicious. He goes back in and he tells the king, he says, listen, I have a message from God, upon which Eglon says, gets up in honor of God. And we know that Eglon is a man who's challenged by gravity. He is a very, he has extra reasons to be troubled by gravity. He always has dessert, apparently. So as he's getting up, and you can imagine the scene, because, when a person who's very heavy is trying to get up, they probably use their hands, right, to push themselves off the seat, which means exposing their front to the person in front of them, which is what Ehud takes advantage of, and takes his dagger off his right flank and drives it straight through Eglon, so much so that it actually his stomach closes over the blade. Right? Now remember, the blade is a cubit in length, so we're talking about a pretty serious endeavor, so much so that some of his spleen, some of his guts fall onto the floor. That's what it says, and it closes above them, which is very helpful because that also just means that there's not that much blood. Right? Just to understand, so this is very helpful because what Ehud then does is he leaves the attic, he leaves the inner chamber, he locks the door behind him, and off he goes. And he waves to the guards, apparently, and there's no reason for them to suspect it. There's no blood. The blade is closed inside. Okay, he's not armed. He heads back, and what he does is he heads back up the mountains. And in the meantime, the guards are like, they timidly knock on the door and there's just no answer. So they say, maybe he needs a private moment, and they wait and they wait and they wait, and the longer they wait, the longer he doesn't answer. And finally, they take the master key, they open up, and they find he's dead. In the meantime, Ehud ran up the mountains to the areas of Har Ephraim, which overlook, like the area of Mitzpeh Yericho further upwards, overlooking Jericho. He blows the horn, and all the Israelites are waiting. They join him in battle, and he charges down the mountain. He does a fantastic thing. What he does is he does not attack Irat Tamarim. He does not attack the city of palms. He takes the Ma'abrot HaYarden. He takes the area of Kasar al-Yehud today, which we were at. He takes the river crossing. Why is that? By essentially doing so, he locks the Moabites into Israel. Then what happens is the Moabites, sensing war, flee to the Jordan crossing, upon which he slaughters them all. Right, so it's an excellent military strategy. We tell that they killed 10,000 Moabites. Ish Shamain. These are also apparently very healthily, well padded members of Moabite society, and he kills them and thereby throws off the yoke of Moab. For 80 years, there's peace. This is a very significant amount of time, and that's the end of this period. So there's a lot to think about right now, before going further. There's so much to appreciate in the story. First of all, just let's get a sense of Moab for a second. So you do me a favor, turn to the last page of the entire notes today. I'm sorry, I put this in a separate section. This is sort of the map of all the Shoftim. You'll notice that Moab is on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. Do you notice that? The southeast side of the Dead Sea, that's where Moab is. Now it happens to be, and Ammon is to the east side, sort of the desert area of Jordan today. The reason why this is significant is if Moab is taking the Ma'abrot HaYarden, the Trans-Jordan crossing, and they're also taking Irat Marim, the date palm city, which is Jericho, then that means to say is they've already made inroads into the tribe of Reuven and Gad, and they've now made inroads into Israel itself. So meaning to say it's not just that they're an outside power, they now are actually in Israel itself. And let me ask you a question, which territory is Jericho in? So it actually belongs to the tribe of Binyamin. We'll get back to that in a second. Okay, do you see that the orange area is Binyamin, which comes all the way down from Jerusalem, all the way down Route 1 to the Jordan River. We just traveled on this actually ourselves when we were on our trip. We went through the green desert down on our first day. This was the tribe of Binyamin going down to Jericho. That's the area. So Jericho is actually in Benjaminite territory. Amazing. Okay. Now a few more things just to appreciate about the story. So first of all, we see another nation which is here. Interestingly, archaeologically, it is fascinating, is that although I did make a request to go visit Jericho, they didn't allow us as Jews because you're only allowed if you're a Muslim and Christian. Okay, but be it as it may, in the city of Jericho today, which is a large urban sprawl like Arab cities are, not very much organization, in the center of the northwest part of the city is a place called Tel Jericho. It's not really big at all. And that is where the mound of ancient Jericho was. And they've researched and they've found the walls have fallen out. They have a problem with the carbon dating. We discussed that on our trip as to the actual dating of this. It seems to be dated a little earlier, but there's a whole debate in archaeology as to when this was. Be as it may, generally speaking, the city was not inhabited. People lived around the city, which makes sense because guess what? Yoshua made a curse on anybody who would inhabit the city. But there is a winter palace to be found on the Tel Jericho, which is dated 100 years later than the destruction of Jericho, which leads some people to suggest this might have been the summer palace of Eglon. Okay. Now again, there's a discussion as to the dating of it, but there is a later building which was on and was destroyed on the Tel of Jericho, and it seems to be palatial, seems to be a very rich person. The observation is this was Eglon's palace. Yes?
Sorry, I didn't catch who killed Eglon.
Ehud. Okay, so which is, by the way, why today Ehud is a very popular Israeli name, right? Meaning all the military leaders are going to, those are the kind of names that stick in Israeli society. It's a secular Israeli society. It's also it's a Jewish name in a Torah sense, but that's why Ehud Barak, Ehud Ormot. That's all Ehuds, and that's taking directly from our story. This victor against the oppressor. But be it as it may, I just put in the notes actually this the picture of Tel Jericho. You can see what it looks like, and in the excavations they found this area which they attribute to Eglon's palace. Be it as it may. Now, a few observations about this as well. Is first of all, you'll notice about Ehud is he's not called a shofet. It doesn't say hu shofat es Yisrael. It says hu hoshia es Yisrael. So already we're seeing a shift between a leader who's going to be the person who's going to be teaching ideas and proliferating thought to a person who's militarily helping them protect themselves. That already is a change from the Osniel situation, right? Yoshua also had both. Yoshua was a teacher and a military leader. Osniel was a teacher and a military leader. Ehud is only a military leader. We've already seen that, so to speak, the differentiation of roles, and we're already now a generation later. We're not talking about somebody who is writing essays, in thought magazines, right? He's a military leader in this respect. That's the Malbim makes his observation. I think there's a few things to notice. Number one is what is the reason why Ehud has access to the king of Moab? So the reason is because they're bringing a mincha shlucha. A mincha literally means a meal offering, so some sort of grain offering. Remember, Yaakov Avinu says the same thing to his sons. When you go back to Egypt, you have to bring some sort of gift from the land of Canaan to give as to placate the emperor of Egypt, so the vizier of Egypt. Similarly, over here, the mincha delegation is clearly an expression of Israel's subservience. I would make this sad observation, as I noticed in the Mishpat Zazav, is a commentary on Sefer Shoftim, who says, where should they really be bringing menachot right now? Is in the Mishkan. But they weren't so interested in that. So guess what? You get to bring menachot somewhere else. Meaning, when you choose to say, God, we don't need to serve you so much, God says, I'll find somebody else for you to serve. So there is a dramatic irony for us, the reader, to realize is that there's no void in service. If we just reject God, He's going to find somebody else, and He's found somebody else for us. There's a sad piece to this as well. Now, there's a really interesting observation which is made, and that is Eglon. How frum is Eglon, right? So he's a pagan, right? He as happens to be, he is a pagan king. But we see something interesting about him. And the Midrash makes this observation. This is the Bamidbar Rabbah in Parashat Shlach. The Midrash says as follows. It says Ki mizrach shemesh ad mevo'ai gadol shemi bagoyim. This is in source 8 at the top of the 7th page. Hashem says, this is a pasuk in Malachi, from east where the sun rises until where it sets in the west, my name is great among the nations. What does that mean? It says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Umas ha'olam, the nations of the world, mechabdinosi, honor me, v'atem kama asisi nisim lachem, machysinosi atem osi. I've done so many miracles for you, and you nation of Israel, don't recognize me whatsoever. And he goes on to explain, Ratzon chaleda, Eglon melech Moab, Adam Arel haya. Eglon was an uncircumcised heathen. Haya v'nichnas Ehud ben Gera etzloi kevin sheyizkir shemi chalak li kavod v'amad. Ehud says, I have a matter from God to speak to you, and he tries to stand up. That means to say that Eglon had an innate sense of respect for the God of Israel. Do you have the same innate sense of respect for the God of Israel? That's what the implications are. So Eglon, in a certain sense, acts as a prosecutor spiritually because of his respect, which we as Israelites don't have. That's the Midrash is implicating in us. Here's an interesting thing. We learn a halacha from Eglon, right? So before he is prematurely deceased, we learn a halacha from his last action. And that is the Darkei Moshe. That's Rav Moshe Isserlis, who writes the Haggais on Shulchan Aruch, says, we learn from here, in source 9, in the second line, Amri Belazar, Kad ani amen yeshmei rabbah, v'kol davar shekdusha, boi lemekam araglohi, quoting Yerushalmi, is that it is important to stand up when you hear Yehei Shmei Rabbah in Kaddish, because if the matter of holiness of God was stood up for by a heathen, uncircumcised king, you should stand when you hear a matter of Kedushas. This happens every day. We learn this directly from our Eglon episode over here. Interesting enough, another interesting point is is that if you look at just the ancient Moabite remains, you go to the area, Petra's more Edom, right, the area in Jordan, but you do have a lot of Moabite remains. When we get later on into Melachim, we look at the Mesha Stili. Mesha was one of the kings of Moab, and we have a lot, that's not a Yiddishism of Moshe. Right, so Mesha was the king of Moabite, the king of the Moabites. We read a lot about him. He has a lot to say. We know about their god, Kamosh. We have a lot of stuff. But nonetheless, if you take a look at the bottom of the page here, I put in a Moabite sarcophagus, right? This is in the Jordan Museum in Amman, in Jordan. And one thing I did notice is that apparently the Moabites were more sizely, right? So if you look at the sarcophagus, it's not like the Egyptian long, right? So which is fascinating. By the way, in those days, size was a sign of riches. It was a sign of strength. Why? Because it didn't mean fast. It was not Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, right? We're not talking about highly processed foods. It means you had enough money to have food, to be strong, to be well. It seems that Moabites were Ish Shamain. Even the people they conquered were called Ish Shamain, these larger people. They were conquered on the way out. It's a demonstration of their wealth, of their success in society. They're not emaciated. Even their sarcophaguses apparently were well fed. So this is just in terms of this. Now, it is interesting to note, and that is something I would like to make the observation on, is Ehud himself. It's an amazing scene. Think about this for a second. Here you have Ehud. What tribe is he from? Ehud we know each person's tribe. So the Tanakh explicitly tells us he's from Binyamin, which makes sense because the area that Moab was settling in, that they make the outpost in Israel, was Jericho, which was in Binyamin, which also speaks to the fragmentation of society. Who is going to be the Moshiach? The Moshiach is not going to be a federal leader. It's going to be a tribal leader who's saying, you're on my grass, right? You're standing on my grass, right? He's like, so you see very clearly over here, this is very much localized, right? Meaning other people probably cared, but they didn't care as much, right? So the fact that Ehud is stepping in is already a sign of localization. But more than that over here, it also sets to me like in motion a sort of a echo we've heard beforehand. Think about the following two scenes. The following scene is in Parashas Vayigash. Into the chamber of the king walks Yehuda, and who is he begging the life for is Binyamin, right? So you have this moment in time where you have the king, the foreign king, is being supplicated to by one tribe of Israel on behalf of another tribe. Yehuda is begging for Binyamin, right? Now fast forward over 1,000 years, and you go to the chambers in Susa in Persia, and you now have another person coming in front of the chambers, of the innermost chambers of the king. And this now person her name is Esther. She comes from Binyamin, and she's supplicating on behalf of the Yehudim. We translate Yehudim as Jews. That's how we do it. But understand there were two types of Jews in Persia. There were Ishimini, there were Benjaminites, and there were Yehudim, because those were the two tribes that were exiled. In a certain sense, you may think, that this is an observation our foreman makes, maybe she could think, I would have protection for my tribesmen. Maybe I could protect the Benjaminites. But she's not doing that. She's going and requesting on behalf of the Yehudim. In a certain sense, it's the same scene on its head, right? Now you have the person of Binyamin in front of the foreign king, requesting on behalf of the other side of the family. But it all comes together in our scene. Why in our scene? Take a look at this incredible Rashi, which is on source 12. Rashi says over here, Vayakom, like you say, he gets off of the throne. Lachein zacha v'yatza mimenu rus. Because of Eglon's willingness to stand for God, he is ultimately going to be the ancestor of Rus HaMaviah. Rus HaMaviah, of course, is the matriarch of King David, which means, full circle, Yehuda stood in front of the foreign king and begged for his son Binyamin. Now Binyamin, Ehud, a representative standing in front of the foreign king, and ultimately murders him, but not before that king produces, this king himself produces, the king, the son of Yehuda. Later on, Esther's going to be doing the same thing. Binyamin, like Ehud, she's going to go in front of the foreign king, and she's going to be requesting on behalf and protecting the rest of Judea. There's clearly a circle which is going around and around over here. This is the same fractal coming up again and again in Tanakh, which should not be overlooked at this point in time, and appreciated in the fuller sense of Ehud. There was something else I wanted to mention here, but it's slipping my mind, so I'm going to skip it. We'll move on to the last section, which is. Yes. I did want to mention this. It should not be lost on us the irony of the name right now. Anybody who's from Benjamin is called Ish Yemini, right? And because that's the word Benjamin, Ben Yamin, Ish Yemini, like Mordechai was Ish Yemini, right? Benjaminite. It should not be lost on us the fact that he can't use his right hand, right? And in fact, later on, at the end of Shoftim, we're going to find out that it wasn't just Ehud, but all of the Benjaminites who were practiced in left-handed swords, which means the men called Ish Yemini are the left-handed men. There's an irony over here in Tanakh, and in a certain sense, it might be interesting to wonder if God is doing the same thing. God is now saving Israel from the left hand, in a certain sense. Nothing against any left-handed people in this room. But in a certain sense, it's no longer the right-handed blast down the enemies, it's the left hand under the garments. Right? It's now a quieter military battle which is being succeeded over here. Just something to be aware of is the transition into the more natural state of affairs, which might be reflected in this. We now have one last pasuk in our parak, which we're going to close with because now time is closing, and that is the last shofet. And you say, why is it one pasuk? Take a look at this last pasuk. It's only one pasuk which tells us about the next person, and that is on the top of page 3. Va'acharav haya Shamgar ben Anas. Vayaches Plishtim Sheish Me'os Ish Belamad Habakar Vayasha Gamu Es Yisrael. He kills 600 Philistines with a cattle prod, and he was also saved Israel. That's all we have about him, right? We don't know where he comes from. We don't know how long he rules for. We just have, this is again an example of like you have so many details by Ehud, and then suddenly Shamgar is just sort of put in the corner that we don't really know so much about him. A few observations about Shamgar, Ben Anas. Now, so first of all is that it is a relatively small victory. If you think about the victory, just Ehud killed how many Moabites? 10,000, right? Shamgar killed 600 Philistines, which is modest. Right, but it's not. It sounded like it was a skirmish, right? And he was able to succeed. Also, notice that as opposed to even using a blade, he's using a cattle prod, right? So already, even just sort of in the language, we're seeing a movement. We're talking about a agrarian society defending themselves with their home implements, right? We're talking about somebody he's not wielding a weapon. He's just taking his cattle prod and killing the Philistines. So already sort of the shift of power. The Philistines clearly have the QME. They have the qualitative military edge. And he is managing to stave them off a little bit at this time. So already we're seeing the wheels are turning in terms of power, the power dimensions over here, which should be noticeable to us. We don't know how long he rules. Chazal say that he was able to prevail for a year. Abarbanel says that maybe in fact his victory was tucked into the next victory, which is Devorah, which is Perek Daled and Perek Hey. And how do we know this? Because when we hear about Devorah's song, she says in her song in the last source on source 14, "Bimei Shamgar ben Anas ki bimei Yael chadu archos v'alchan sivois yalchu archos al kalkalos." So he describes that in the times of Shamgar, people would not travel on the main highways because it was too dangerous. They would go al kalkalos. They would go on the side roads. Apparently there was anarchy. Apparently there was not safety on traveling on the roads. And this is in the days of Shamgar and Yael, which is the times of Devorah herself, which means that it might even be that Shamgar is tucked into the Devorah days. Okay, so very little we hear about him. I want to make just the following observation, which I think is a remarkable observation. I saw in the Maggid series on Koren on this, which is as follows: that actually there's an observation made by Rabbi Eliezer in the Gemara in Sukkot Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Rabbi Eliezer says there was no tribe who was absent of a shofet, who did not produce a local leader, right? Which is interesting because Rashi then says in that Gemara, listen to what Rashi says, Moshe shel Yisrael oison shal yu mishemes Yoshua ad Shmuel, shemoshach shaul lamelech Yoshua, and he goes the following: Yoshua me Ephraim, Yoshua was the leader from Ephraim, Ehud mi Binyamin, that's what we just learned today, Gidon mi Menashe, Harei mi b'nei Rachel. Shimshon mi Dan, Barak mi Keresh Naphtali, Harei mi b'nei Bila. Ivtzan ze Boaz mi Yehuda, Eli, we're going to see at the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, is from Levi. Tola is from Yisachar. Elon has Zvulani is from Zvulun. And these are the ones which are explicit, meaning to say we have the Shoftim who are explicitly attributed to tribes are given to us. Rashi then says, he says, Mefurashim, Aval Osniel v'yiftach v'shamgar v'yair v'avdon lo yadati shemois shivteihem. We don't know which tribes these come from, Shamgar included. And he goes, and Rashi continues to say, Umi Ruvain v'Shimon v'Gad v'Asher lamatzasi mufurash. And also we don't know any leaders from the tribes of Ruvain, Shimon, Gad, and Asher. Okay? So Rashi kind of leaves it out and says, here are the remaining Shoftim that are not attributed to a tribe, and here are the tribes not attributed to a Shofet, and he kind of leaves it that way. This is Rashi in the Gemara and Sukkah. So, interesting observation. It is possible to argue, just by process of elimination, the following. It is possible to argue that Reuven and Gad did not produce a Shofet, which makes sense because they were Transjordan, they were more of a annex, they were more of a satellite to Israel. We can understand that. The remaining two tribes which didn't produce the Shofet, we don't see at least explicitly, is Asher and Shimon. Asher, already in the first parak we learned in Sefer Shoftim, we're told lives among the Canaanites, right? And in fact, even when Devorah criticizes the tribes for not coming to her aid, she does not even criticize Asher. It's almost as if it's a foregone conclusion. The very north there, they're not going to be helping. The remaining tribe which leaves us, one tribe that we could might associate with Shamgar is Shimon, which is fascinating because who is the enemy that he is defending against? Is the Plishtim. Where do the Plishtim live? If you take a look at the page on the last page, the Philistines live along the coastline in Gaza, right? They live from Ashdod, Ashkelon, up to Tel Aviv area, right? That's where the Philistines live, which is right next to where Shimon lives as well, right? There are only two Shoftim in all of the of Sefer Shoftim who are fighting against the Philistines. One is Shamgar ben Anas, and the other one is Shimshon. Shimshon's we're going to have 3 full chapters on Shimshon. There's a lot on Shimshon. It is interesting that both of them fight, and it's also interesting their methodology of fighting as well. Because if you remember, one of the great victories of Shimshon was where he killed a cartload of Philistines using the jawbone of a donkey. That was his weapon of choice at the point in time. And here we have Shamgar. What's he doing? Not very conventional in the same way. He's also using a cattle prod as well, which is fascinating because in a certain sense, here we have this minor Shofet, in a certain sense, who's this proto-Shimshonite kind of character who arrives over here, but he's eclipsed. It may be that his tribal origin is hidden because, as the Yalkut Shimoni says, that Shimon did not produce a Shofet. Why does the Yalkut say that? The Gemara says every tribe produced a Shofet. It might be because Shimon was still in the shadow of that terrible episode of Baal Peor, which happened just before they entered the land of Israel, and it was seen as bad leaders. Zimri, their leader, really did a very bad thing and publicly actually received a huge amount of indictment as a function of that. So in that respect, perhaps Tanakh is lowering the volume on this Shofet because it lives in the wake, in the shadow of a previous leader, Shimon, who wasn't so great as well. But nonetheless, a Shofet he still is. So even within the small amount of the Perek, we've had 120 years, 40 years of Osniel, 80 years of Ehud, a year or a wrapped in year of Shamgar, leading us to one of the most magnificent battles, Be'ezrat Hashem. When we go to Israel for the Shoftim trip, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will visit the place of the next battle, Be'ezrat Hashem, which is going to be the brook of Kishon, the incredible battle. And I'll leave you on a cliffhanger for next year. Is that I believe this is where J.R.R. Tolkien actually provides one of the most important battles in the Lord of the Rings is from our next chapter. Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll get